Landlord quickly evicted me after 20 years, but I was prepared. He had no idea what was coming. The letter that destroyed my life arrived on a Tuesday. It was one of those perfect autumn mornings, crisp air, golden sunlight filtering through half-bare trees, the kind of day that usually filled me with contentment. I had just finished my ritual, coffee on the small balcony overlooking Mapleton Street, watching the neighborhood wake up. 20 years of the same view, and it never grew old. The official-looking envelope was cream-colored with the return address embossed rather than printed. Lewis Property Management. My fingers trembled as I tore it open. Mr. Lewis never sent letters to tenants. In 20 years, I'd received exactly 3 pieces of mail from him. The paper inside was stiff, formal, and devastating. Notice of termination of tenancy. Below that, legal language that boiled down to 5 simple words. I was being kicked out. 30 days. After 2 decades in apartment 4B, I had 30 days to dismantle my life. I must have read it 10 times, convinced there was some mistake. My rent was always on time, early even. I was quiet, respectful of neighbors, and had maintained the place impeccably. The hardwood floors gleamed just as they had when I moved in, though they now bore the invisible marks of my son Michael's first steps, his high school graduation party, and the 1,000 quiet nights I'd spent building a life here. The phone felt heavy as I dialed the management office. Lewis Property Management, this is Diane. The receptionist's voice was cheerful, oblivious to how my world was collapsing. This is Sarah Chun from 4B. I just received an eviction notice, and there must be some mistake. My voice remained surprisingly steady. I've lived here for 20 years without any issues. Oh, a pause. Let me transfer you to Mr. Lewis. The line clicked, then rang 3 times before he picked up. Thomas Lewis. His voice was clipped, efficient. Mr. Lewis, this is Sarah Chun from apartment 4B. I just received an eviction notice and… Yes, Miss Chun. The notices went out to all remaining tenants yesterday. No greeting, no acknowledgement of our history. Just business. But why? I've never been late with rent, never caused any problems. It's nothing personal, he interrupted. The building is being converted to luxury condominiums. This has been in planning for some time. Some time? And you're just telling us now? Heat flushed my face. I've lived here for 20 years. My son grew up here. I can't just leave in 30 days. The notice is fully compliant with state law. His voice remained maddeningly calm. The market has shifted, Miss Chen. This neighborhood is prime real estate now. Because people like me made it worth living in, I shot back. We built this community while you collected our rent checks from your office across town. Again, this is simply business. The building's future value far exceeds what it generates as rental units. What about our lease agreements? I was grasping now, searching for any lifeline. Your lease converted to month 18 years ago. As stated in the notice, we're providing the legally required 30 days. That's barely enough time to find a new place, let alone pack and move 2 decades of life. I was nearly shouting now. Please, I just need more time. 6 months, even 3. The timeline is non-negotiable. His voice hardened. Contractors begin work next month. I suggest you start looking for new accommodations immediately. Mr. Lewis, I've been a perfect tenant for 20 years. I knew your father before you took over. He would have at least offered some kind of transition assistance. My father's sentimentality is precisely why these buildings remained undervalued rentals for so long, he cut in coldly. The market has evolved, Ms. Chen. I suggest you do the same. Something inside me cracked then, not into pieces, but into a new shape entirely. You have no idea what you're doing, I said quietly. He actually laughed. I assure you, Ms. Chun, I know exactly what I'm doing. This conversion will triple the property's value. It's just business. No, I replied, my voice deadly calm now. It's my home. I hung up before he could respond. The apartment seemed different as I stood in the center of my living room, as if it had already begun pulling away from me. 20 years of life surrounded me. The bookshelf Michael and I had built together, the scuff on the wall where my Christmas tree always stood, the window seat where I'd read hundreds of books while watching the seasons change. My phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor Elena. "Did you get it too?" I looked out my window to the street below, where two elderly neighbors stood on the sidewalk, papers clutched in their hands, faces stricken. Mr. Abernathy had lived here for 35 years. Mrs. Delgado was pushing 70 and had nowhere else to go. The second wave hit me then, not sadness this time, but rage. Cold, precise rage that cleared my mind like a winter wind. Most people didn't know that before scaling back to raise Michael as a single mother, I'd worked as a successful real estate development consultant for 15 years. I understood property values, market trends, and investment strategies intimately. I'd helped orchestrate similar building conversions myself, though always with generous relocation packages and extended timelines for existing tenants. Mr. Lewis had no idea who he was dealing with. I walked to my home office, once Michael's bedroom before he left for college, and opened my laptop. I pulled up property records, recent sales comps, zoning regulations, and development permits. Then came Mr. Lewis's business history, easily traced through public records. What I found made me smile for the first time that day. Thomas Lewis had inherited his father's properties, but not his business acumen. He'd over-leveraged himself on several recent acquisitions, taking on significant debt just as interest rates were rising. Our building wasn't being converted because the market was peaking. It was being converted because Thomas needed cash flow fast. I made 3 phone calls that afternoon. The first to my old colleague James at Westside Realty, who still owed me favors. The second to my former boss, Patricia, who had recently launched an investment fund focused on preserving affordable housing. The third to my son Michael, now a corporate attorney specializing in real estate law. As I sealed my first box of belongings that evening, I felt something unexpected amid the pain and anger, a thrill of anticipation. Mr. Lewis thought he was simply clearing out insignificant tenants. He had no idea what was coming. The first month after eviction was the hardest. I moved into my sister May's spare bedroom, my life compressed into boxes stacked in her garage. At night, I'd dream of my old apartment, waking with the disorienting realization that my home of 20 years was gone. "You can stay as long as you need," May insisted over breakfast. Michael called again. "He's worried." "I'm fine," I said, though we both knew it wasn't true. "I've got interviews lined up at 3 real estate firms." What I didn't tell her was that I had no intention of working for someone else again. The calls I'd made on eviction day were already bearing fruit. Patricia from my old firm had been intrigued by what I discovered about Lewis's financial situation. "He's a classic over-leveraged developer," she said during our coffee meeting. "One bad project away from collapse." "And I want to be that bad project," I replied, sliding a business proposal across the table. She raised an eyebrow as she scanned the document. "You want to buy the vacant lot next to your old building? That's ambitious, Sarah. I've been watching it for years. The owner's been holding out for a ridiculous price, but I know he's finally ready to sell." Patricia tapped her manicured finger on the proposal. "And you think Lewis will try to acquire it once he realizes its potential?" "He has to. His luxury condo conversion needs that extra land for parking. Without it, he'll have to reduce his unit count by 30%. "How do you know he hasn't approached the owner already?" I smiled. "Because the owner is my former brother-in-law, and he hates entitled rich kids like Thomas Lewis." 3 weeks later, I signed the papers on the vacant lot. My investment pool was modest. My savings, a loan against my 401k, and a small group of investors Patricia had assembled, former tenants of Lewis Properties who were eager for a bit of justice. The morning after closing, I stood on my new property. It wasn't much, a crumbling parking lot with an abandoned storefront, but its location was perfect. Through the chain-link fence, I could see construction crews gutting my former home, tossing 20 years of community into dumpsters. The rage returned, but this time I channeled it. I pulled out my phone and called James from Westside Realty. "The permits came through," he said without preamble. "Lewis has no idea you're the buyer. His team's been trying to contact the seller for weeks." "Perfect. How long before he figures it out?" "When he sees the construction start. Which reminds me, are you sure about this cafe idea? Commercial real estate is volatile. It's not about the money, I replied. It's about location. 6 weeks of frantic work followed. I leveraged every contact from my former career, calling in favors from contractors, designers, and suppliers. My sister's dining table became command central, covered in blueprints and material samples. Michael flew in for a weekend, reviewing contracts and helping secure the necessary permits. "Mom, this is more than revenge," he said one night. "You're building something." I paused, considering his words. Maybe I am. The Home Again Cafe opened exactly 3 months after my eviction. I designed it deliberately: warm woods, comfortable seating, prices just low enough to draw the neighborhood in, but high enough to be sustainable. The moment I unlocked the doors that first morning, I knew we'd succeed. By week 2, we had regulars. By month 2, there was a line out the door every morning. And from my counter, I had a perfect view of Lewis's building, where construction delays were clearly visible. Rumors circulated about permit problems and contractor disputes. I served coffee with a smile, building relationships with every customer. When people complained about rising rents or the changing neighborhood, I listened. When local artists needed wall space, I offered it. When community groups needed meeting space, I stayed open late. One afternoon, a sleek black Audi parked outside. Thomas Lewis himself walked in, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock when he recognized me behind the counter. "Miss Chun," he said stiffly. "I didn't realize this was your establishment." I smiled my most professional smile. "Mr. Lewis, what can I get you?" He glanced around at the packed cafe, at the local artwork on the walls, at the casual luxury I'd created at a fraction of his budget. "Just checking out the competition," he muttered. "Competition?" I kept my voice light. "I'm just a small business owner serving coffee. You're building luxury condos." His eyes narrowed. "You know exactly what you're doing. This lot was for sale. Just business, right?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "How did you even afford this place?" "I had help from friends. People who believe in community over profit." "Charming," he sneered. "But sentiment doesn't pay the bills. Your cafe won't stop progress." I handed him a free coffee card with my perfect customer service smile. "Progress isn't always what we think it is, Mr. Lewis. Sometimes it's a return to what matters." As he left, I noticed 3 potential buyers for his condos sitting in the corner, watching our exchange with interest. They'd been asking about the neighborhood earlier. I made sure to stop by their table with complimentary pastries, casually mentioning the history of our beloved building across the street and what had happened to its long-term residents. The first seed was planted. 6 months after opening Home Again Cafe, I expanded. Not with a second location, but by transforming our unused back room into a co-working space. It wasn't a revolutionary idea, but the timing was perfect. Lewis's luxury condos were finally hitting the market, targeted at young professionals who worked remotely, exactly the demographic flocking to my cafe daily. $20 a day gets you unlimited coffee, high-speed internet, and a comfortable workspace, I explained to customers. Memberships sold out in a week. Meanwhile, Lewis's sales were sluggish. The cafe had become the neighborhood information hub, and I made sure everyone knew about his history as a landlord. Not through gossip, I was too smart for that, but through community organizing. "We're hosting a tenants' rights workshop tonight," I announced one morning, posting flyers by the register. "Former residents of the Lewis building will share their experiences." That evening, our co-working space transformed into a standing room-only forum. Mrs. Delgado, trembling slightly, described how she'd been forced to move in with her daughter 3 towns away. Mr. Abernathy explained how his fixed income couldn't accommodate the sudden move. Elena showed pictures of her son's bedroom, hastily emptied after 20 years of memories. A local reporter happened to be working in our co-working space that day. The story ran in the community section. Displaced residents share stories as luxury development struggles to attract buyers. Lewis called me the next morning. "You're interfering with my business," he hissed. "I'm serving coffee and hosting community events. You're poisoning potential buyers against my development. I'm simply providing a platform for people to share their experiences." Transparency is important in real estate. Wouldn't you agree? He was silent for a moment. What do you want, Sarah? Money? Is that it? The use of my first name, this sudden familiarity, caught me off guard. But only for a second. What I wanted was my home, Thomas. Now I want something different. Name your price. It's not for sale. 2 weeks later, Lewis launched an aggressive marketing campaign for his condos, slashing prices by 15%. That same week, I partnered with a local real estate agent, one with an impeccable reputation for ethical practices, to offer free housing consultations in our co-working space. When potential buyers came to view Lewis's condos, they inevitably stopped at my cafe before or after. My staff, well-trained and passionate about our mission, would casually mention our housing consultations. Just to make sure you're getting a fair deal, they'd say with genuine concern. The market can be so tricky these days. Our consultant didn't directly discourage purchases in Lewis's building. That would be unprofessional. Instead, she presented comparable properties with better value propositions, highlighting hidden costs in Lewis's contracts that many first-time buyers missed. Sales at the Lewis building crawled. Instead of the quick sellout he'd projected to his investors, he was lucky to close 1 unit a month. Construction on the second phase stalled. My cafe thrived. I added a small bookstore section featuring local authors. I hosted networking events that connected my co-working members with job opportunities. I created a community bulletin board where neighbors could offer services or seek help. On the 1-year anniversary of my eviction, I launched my boldest move yet, a nonprofit housing advocacy group headquartered in my cafe's meeting room. We offered free legal consultations for tenants facing eviction and published a fair housing guide that rated local landlords on transparency, maintenance responsiveness, and ethical practices. Lewis Properties received the lowest rating in the city. The next morning, Thomas Lewis stormed into my cafe during the morning rush. His normally immaculate appearance was disheveled, tie loosened, dark circles under his eyes. "Enough," he said loudly enough for nearby customers to hear. "This vendetta has gone too far." I gestured toward my office in the back, aware of phones recording our interaction. Once inside, I closed the door. "Is something wrong with your coffee?" I asked pleasantly. "You know exactly what you're doing," he snapped. "My investors are pulling out. The bank is questioning my loan terms. All because you've turned the neighborhood against me." The neighborhood was never yours to begin with, Thomas. It belonged to the people who lived here, who built lives here. People like me, who you discarded without a second thought. He ran a hand through his hair. "Look, I made a mistake, okay? I should have handled the evictions differently. But this, what you're doing, it's destroying everything I've built." For a moment, I felt a flicker of sympathy. Then I remembered the look on Mrs. Delgado's face as she was forced from her home. "It's just business," I said softly. "Nothing personal." When he left, I noticed a document he'd forgotten on my desk, a bank notice warning of possible foreclosure on the Lewis building if sales targets weren't met within 90 days. I made a copy before having my assistant return the original. Then I called Patricia. "Phase 2 is ready," I said. "It's time to make our move." The forgotten bank notice was my Rosetta Stone. It revealed everything: exact loan amounts, payment schedules, and most importantly, the terms under which the bank could force a sale. Thomas Lewis wasn't just struggling, he was drowning in debt. "This is gold," Patricia said when I showed her the document. We sat in a private room at her investment firm, the paper between us like a treasure map. "But we need more capital than we currently have to make a serious play." "I've been thinking about that," I replied, sliding a folder across the table. "What if we're not the only ones he's burned?" The folder contained names of other Lewis Properties tenants who'd been evicted across the city, dozens of them, compiled through my housing advocacy network. "You want to build a coalition of his victims?" Patricia raised an eyebrow. "Crowdsourced revenge?" "I prefer to call it community-based investment," I said. "Most won't have much to contribute financially, but their stories add moral weight. And those who can invest will be highly motivated." Patricia nodded slowly. "The timing works. Commercial real estate values are softening, and banks are getting nervous about their loan portfolios." We worked through the night, crafting a business plan and investment proposal. The next morning, I began making calls. Within a week, we had commitments from 15 former tenants with investment capacity. Within 2 weeks, we'd secured meetings with 3 of Lewis's minor investors who were looking to exit their positions. Meanwhile, I executed another plan. Using my cafe as headquarters, I began quietly acquiring property around Lewis's building. First, a small parking lot he'd been eyeing for overflow parking. Then a rundown bookstore whose owner was ready to retire. Next, a vacant lot that would have given him street visibility. It was low-key property monopoly. I wasn't buying prime real estate, just the odd parcels Lewis would need if his development were to succeed. Each purchase was done through different LLCs with benign names: community partners, neighborhood holdings, local legacy investments. Lewis was too distracted by his immediate financial crisis to notice the pattern. His condo sales had all but stopped. Contractors were filing liens for unpaid work. The pressure from his major investors was mounting. The power shifted so gradually that he never saw it coming. 3 months after finding the bank notice, I received a call from James at Westside Realty. "It's happening," he said. "The bank is calling Lewis's loan. They're forcing an auction next month." That evening, I hosted a special meeting at my cafe after closing hours. Around a table sat former tenants, small business owners displaced by Lewis's previous developments, and my core investment team. Even Michael flew in for the occasion. "The auction will be quiet," I explained. "The bank wants to avoid publicity. We'll have one chance to make our move." "Are we really going to be able to outbid corporate buyers?" asked Elena, who'd invested her entire severance package from her recent layoff. "Most developers won't touch a failed project. It's bad karma," I said. "And we have an advantage they don't. We know exactly what this property is worth to the community." In the weeks before the auction, I barely slept. We secured our financing, a patchwork of investments from over 50 community members combined with traditional lending Patricia had arranged. Our consortium had a clear mission: reclaim the building and transform it into something that served the neighborhood. The morning of the auction was surreal. I'd chosen my outfit carefully. Not the casual cafe owner, but the successful real estate professional I'd once been. As I entered the bank's conference room, Thomas Lewis sat alone at the front, his attorney whispering urgently in his ear. When he saw me, his face drained of color. "What are you doing here?" he hissed as I passed. "Investing in the community," I replied simply, taking my seat with Patricia and our attorney. The auction proceeded quickly. Lewis made a desperate opening bid, clearly reaching for financing he didn't have. 2 corporate entities made perfunctory offers, but their hearts weren't in it. Then Patricia nodded to me. I stated our consortium's bid, exactly 15% above the outstanding loan amount. The room fell silent. The bank representative looked relieved. They just wanted to clear the bad debt from their books. Going once, going twice. The bank's auctioneer paused, looking around the room. Lewis stared straight ahead, defeated. "Sold to Community Heritage Partners." As we signed the paperwork, Lewis approached, his expression a mix of rage and disbelief. "You planned this from the beginning," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "The cafe, the advocacy group, all of it was to get my building." I looked up from the documents. "Not just your building, Thomas. Your legacy." He walked out without another word. Later that evening, as my investors celebrated at the cafe, I slipped away to visit my old building for the first time since my eviction. Standing in the unfinished lobby, keys in hand, I felt not triumph, but responsibility. This wasn't just revenge anymore. It was restoration. What I didn't know until we received the complete property records was that Thomas Lewis had purchased one of his own luxury condos, the penthouse, as his personal residence. In the maze of shell companies and LLCs, this detail had remained hidden until our takeover was complete. Thomas Lewis was now my tenant. I discovered this 3 days after the auction, while reviewing the sales records with our attorney. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who had evicted me from my home of 20 years now lived in a building I controlled. "What are you going to do?" Michael asked when I called to tell him. I considered the question carefully. "Nothing immediate," I replied. That would make me no better than him. Instead, I focused on transforming the half-finished building. We halted the luxury renovations and redesigned the unsold units, nearly 70% of the building, as affordable housing with long-term lease protections. The ground floor, originally planned for high-end boutiques, became community spaces, a daycare center, a senior activities room, and an expansion of my bookstore. Meanwhile, Thomas kept a low profile. I occasionally spotted him entering or exiting the building, his once confident stride now hesitant, his designer suits replaced by casual wear. He avoided the cafe, taking the long way around the block rather than passing my windows. 3 months after our takeover, his first HOA payment came due under the new ownership. I'd maintained the fees he had established, some of the highest in the city, but redirected them toward actual building improvements rather than cosmetic luxuries. He paid without comment. For months in, the pipes in his unit developed a leak. He filed a maintenance request through the online portal we'd established. I assigned the repair to our maintenance team with standard priority, which meant a response within 48 hours, not the immediate attention he'd been accustomed to providing for wealthy clients. When he called to complain about the delay, I personally took the call. "Miss Chun," he said, clearly surprised to hear my voice. "I wasn't expecting you to handle resident concerns directly. I believe in hands-on management," I replied evenly. "Unlike the previous owner." A pause. "My ceiling is actively leaking. Our maintenance team will address it within the timeframe specified in your lease agreement. The same timeframe you considered reasonable for your tenants." "This is personal," he said, his voice tight. "No, Thomas. It's just business. Proper management requires prioritization of resources." The maintenance crew arrived exactly 47 hours after his initial request. Over the next few months, I watched him gradually adjust to life as a regular tenant. He attended resident meetings, where I made sure he was treated with the same respect as everyone else, no more, no less. He used the community spaces occasionally, sitting alone with his laptop in the corner of the shared lounge we'd created. As his first year as my tenant neared its end, I scheduled a meeting to discuss his lease renewal. The conference room in the building, once intended as a wine-tasting space for residents, now served as our management office. He arrived precisely on time, dressed in business casual attire that still probably cost more than most people's formal wear. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a guarded wariness. "Thank you for coming in." I began professionally. "As you know, your lease is up for renewal next month." He nodded stiffly. "We've been reassessing all units based on market conditions and building expenses." I slid a document across the table. "These are the new terms." He scanned the page, his expression shifting from neutral to shock. "This is a 40% increase in HOA fees." "Yes," I replied calmly. "We've expanded community services substantially, and costs have risen accordingly." "This is highway robbery," he snapped. "You're targeting me specifically." "Actually, we're implementing proportional fees based on square footage. As the owner of the largest unit, your increase is the most substantial. Simple mathematics." "I can't afford this," he admitted, the words clearly painful to speak. "I understand financial circumstances change," I said, echoing his own dismissive tone from our last conversation in my old apartment. "Perhaps you should consider downsizing to a more modest unit." His face flushed with anger, then abruptly drained of color as understanding dawned. "You're evicting me, just like I evicted you." "Not at all," I countered. "I'm offering you options. You can renew at the new rate, downsize to a smaller unit, or seek housing elsewhere. You have 30 days to decide." He stared at me for a long moment. "You've been planning this from the beginning, haven't you?" "The whole time." I gathered my papers without answering. "I'll need more time," he said finally, "to figure things out." I met his gaze directly. "I'm afraid the timeline is non-negotiable. Market forces, you understand." When he left my office, his shoulders were slumped in defeat. I felt no triumph, only a somber sense of justice. The cycle was complete. A week later, I received his notice to vacate. As he carried boxes to his car on moving day, I approached with an envelope. "What's this?" he asked warily. "Your security deposit. In full, with interest." He looked at me with confusion. "Why?" "Because that's what decent landlords do, Thomas. That's the difference between us." 5 years passed in what felt like the blink of an eye. What began as a personal vendetta transformed into something I never could have anticipated, a movement. The morning after Thomas Lewis moved out, I stood in his empty penthouse. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the vast emptiness of luxury designed for display rather than living. I knew immediately what it should become. "Are you sure about this?" Patricia asked when I presented my plan to convert the penthouse into a community center. "It could fetch premium rent." "We're not about premium rent anymore," I replied. "We're about premium living for everyone." We divided the sprawling space into a free legal clinic for housing issues, a financial literacy center, and meeting rooms for community organizing. On the wall, we mounted a simple plaque, "The Legacy Center," because everyone deserves a home. Never once did it mention Thomas Lewis or me. Meanwhile, our housing model flourished. We established transparent pricing, maintenance response guarantees, and tenant representation on our management board. When units became available, priority went to families facing displacement elsewhere in the city. We maintained reasonable profits, enough to satisfy our investors and expand operations, but never at the expense of our mission. The real breakthrough came in year 3, when the city council approached us to develop a template for ethical housing management that could be replicated citywide. "Your model proves that affordable housing can be financially sustainable," the housing commissioner told me during a public hearing. "It just requires prioritizing community over excessive profit." As I testified before the council, I spotted a familiar face in the back row. Thomas Lewis sat quietly, watching the proceedings. He looked different, older, certainly, but also somehow diminished. Our eyes met briefly before he looked away. He slipped out before I finished speaking, and I never saw him again. Our success attracted attention from developers and investors alike. Some came to learn, genuinely interested in our community-centered approach. Others came to acquire, seeing only dollar signs and potential conversions. "Venture capital firms are circling," Michael warned during one of his visits. Now a partner at his law firm specializing in community development, he'd become our legal counsel. "They'll offer you a fortune to sell your stake." "It was never about money," I reminded him. "I know, Mom. But power has a way of changing people. Look at Lewis." His words stayed with me. To protect against future corruption, even my own, I worked with Michael to establish a trust structure that would maintain our mission in perpetuity. No single person, including me, could alter the community-focused direction of our growing portfolio. The cafe continued to thrive, expanding to 3 locations across the city. Each one became a neighborhood anchor, offering not just coffee but connection. We hired locally, paid living wages, and created career paths into property management for interested employees. On the 5th anniversary of our takeover, we hosted a community celebration in the courtyard of the original building, my building, though I never thought of it that way anymore. As residents and neighbors mingled, sharing food and stories, Mrs. Delgado approached me, leaning on her cane. "I never thought I'd be back here," she said, gazing up at her old window, now occupied by a young family. "But it feels right this time." "It does," I agreed. "You know," she continued, "I saw Mr. Lewis last month at the grocery store.
He didn't recognize me."
He was buying discount bread and counting coins. I felt an unexpected pang of empathy. What happened to him? I asked around. After leaving here, he tried to rebuild in another city.
Failed.
Lost his investors' trust. Now he works as a property manager for someone else's company. Entry level. She patted my hand. "Your revenge was complete without you even knowing it." I shook my head. This stopped being about revenge a long time ago. And it was true. Somewhere along the way, the driving force had shifted from hurting him to helping others. The sweetest revenge hadn't been watching him fall. It had been creating something meaningful from the ashes of what he destroyed. As twilight descended, I wandered through the building that had once been my home, now home to dozens of families creating their own memories within these walls. My name appeared nowhere, not on plaques or directories, yet my legacy was embedded in every fair lease, every promptly fixed faucet, every community garden on the roof. Thomas Lewis had vanished into obscurity, his name forgotten by most. But the community he had tried to destroy? It was thriving, stronger than ever. And that was the best revenge of all.